Coming up on the road to now.
Here in New Haven, one of my favorite things that we did was we attempted a national currency. This is where something called a Fugio cent was minted, again on Water Street, right up the street from Benedict Arnold's old house, which also Benedict Arnold's old house ended up becoming Noah Webster's house.
Wow.
And Noah Webster, in a very American democratic thing, started writing the American dictionary in that house here in New Haven. It's John Quincy Adams. It's one of my favorite things actually here in the museum is a photo of him from around that trial. So it's wild because it's one of the first photos.
Oh, wow.
And it's this guy that was I always like to look at it and be like, you can tell what his eyes had seen.
I'm Bob Crawford.
And I'm Ben Sawyer.
And this is The Road to Now.
And once again, we have been taken to different locations. I am currently sitting in Santa Monica, California. And Bob, where you at?
I'm in Spokane, Washington.
Wow.
Yeah.
First, was it Toledo the other day?
It was Toledo the other day. Now it's Spokane. I'm at a casino.
The high life.
The high life. That's right.
Well, we're in different locations, but we're going to introduce everyone to a second interview you did from New Haven. So could you tell us about that one?
The gentleman's name is Jason Bischoff-Wurstle, and he is the photo archivist for the New Haven Museum. And I'll tell you, he's a real young guy, real excited about history, very thorough in his work. And we had a great conversation about the history of New Haven and all the many really monumental historical events that have happened in that city.
Yeah, and it's interesting how that city, most people know it for Yale, but when you go back and you look, you see that it has played a significant role in shaping the 18th century, the 19th century, up to the 20th century. And I think Jason has done a great job of connecting the more recent history to today.
Jason has a plan to identify recent historical markers at places like where Kurt Cobain played, or things that have happened in the past 20 years in New Haven. He believes that history is not a destination; it's what we all do, and that's kind of like you and I.
Exactly, and that's what's great is that with our last podcast, one of the things I think we've really teased out is that history is not 100 years ago, 200 years ago. For some of the folks we've talked to, understanding the last 20 years and their experiences has helped us understand where they stand now.
Jason Bischoff-Wurstle, welcome to The Road to Now. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Welcome to the New Haven Museum here in New Haven, Connecticut.
This is a beautiful, beautiful building.
Thank you.
Maybe we'll start off. You just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do.
Sure. So my name is Jason Bischoff-Wurstle. I'm the Director of the Photo Archives here at the New Haven Museum, and I also co-host a local podcast dealing with New Haven history called This Day in New Haven History that broadcasts on WNHH 103.5 FM and streams worldwide.
A great radio station for anybody who's interested, and Jason's show is excellent. I highly recommend it. This is kind of a dual podcast here today. Well, I was coming to New Haven. The band I'm in, the Avett Brothers, were playing tonight at the College Street Music Hall.
Yes.
And I was looking for historical threads that I can tug on, and I found you.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a brief phone conversation, and there were a few things that I was aware of, Benedict Arnold's connection to this town, and the Amistad trial.
Yes.
But you told me a whole lot of other history nuggets that I had no knowledge of. So can you go back to the beginning of this town colony
Sure.
of New Haven and kind of tell us when it started and why it started?
Sure. So New Haven was founded in 1638, and it was founded initially as a religious colony. And the gist of it is that Puritan settlers came over from England and they settled in Boston, and Boston wasn't pure enough. And so they wanted to strike out and set up their own colony south of Boston, and we lie down the coast here. Of course, with all these things, it was a little more complicated. Of course, they owed money because you didn't just get here to the New World for free. That's another one of those sort of ideas that people tend to have, like thinking of yesterday being July 4th. And it's like, oh, we became free that day. It's generally a little more complicated. If you get on a boat and you come over, you got to pay someone. So they owed people money, and they had to get a colony going that made money for them, paid off their debts, but at the same time established this uber religious, for lack of a better term, like kind of kingdom. And so they came here. They had scouted out down the coastline here. And again, New Haven falls between Boston to our north, and we've got New York City to the south of us. And New York at that point was still predominantly Dutch, and so it was doing its own thing, as New York tends to do. And the settlers came. They landed here in 1638. There had already been a tribe of Indians called the Quinnipiac living here. Their numbers at that point were kind of decimated, basically due to disease, which had decimated a lot of Indians or Native Americans throughout New England and the, quote, New World, but also local wars among the tribes. So the legend has it, more or less, that once the settlers came here to New Haven, there wasn't a shot fired. Basically, they negotiated a truce, and in doing so, provided the Quinnipiac tribe with the first known reservation, Native American reservation in North America. And that was founded here within what's now the city borders of New Haven.
Wow, it's really interesting. You talk about when people migrated from Boston to New Haven, it was kind of out of necessity as much as it was out of a way of pushing the boundaries and exploring and moving further and establishing a new place. They kind of had to, because they were up against the gun with money,
yeah,
and religious freedom to them. But Ben and I just did a show recently where we talked about westward migration,
mm-hmm.
and there's this romantic idea of the pioneers moving west, and they did it to explore,
yes,
and
exactly,
and to extend democracy. But really, they did it because they had run out of money in the East, and there was a depression, and there was no opportunity. So they did it because they had to, as much as anything else.
Exactly, and that tends to happen. And I say this often here at the New Haven Museum, and I say this often on our show as well. There's the lofty ideals. There's these things, and generally it comes down to money. It comes down to the basics. It's like, how are you going to feed your family? How are you going to raise your family? Do you owe this person this? How are you going to get ahead? And it's always an idea of getting ahead, and what that degree is. And so America allows for that, and that's a basis of what we do. But yeah, it's a lot of times this all gets bundled up into that kind of the grade school idea, like
right, the way we are taught history.
Yeah, exactly.
And what the historian is the editor.
Right, and that's a great point, because that's one of the things I love. I love being able to work in history to begin with, and then being able to look and study the historiography, looking at how people interpreted history at different times, because no matter what you're studying, you could be studying American pop culture, and you could be looking at Elvis Presley, and like, okay, well, this was what people thought about him in 1972. Here we are in 1994 looking at him. Here we are in 2016 looking at him. And each viewpoint's going to change, and also how each historian is informed is going to change.
Right. Most recently, we see this with Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah,
who
exactly.
was the early part of the 20th century. He was despised.
Mm-hmm.
Now he's like, as we say in the parlance of Zoolander, he's so hot right now.
Yeah.
So what got you into history?
Kind of. I've just been into it my whole life. I've just really found an interest. I find the interest in the stories, and just that. There's always something every single day that I can come to work and learn something new. and that's really awesome that that's my job. But yeah, in general, I mean, since as long as I can remember, it's a topic that, like, I like math, I like science. I'm not good at either one of them. I can understand the ideas, and that's just it. It's just the imagination. It's like, oh, there's always something out there. There's always a story. There's always just that different tale to tell.
I find all the characters of fiction, all the great characters of fiction exist in history, and they were real. You have the scoundrels and the heroes and the people that were bad and they redeemed themselves, and the people that were good, and like Benedict Arnold.
Yeah,
they
who's an incredible character, incredible American character.
So let's pick back up. The Puritans established New Haven.
Yes. So they established New Haven. This is 1638, and what they did in establishing it, so they had this Native American reservation, and when they laid out the colony, they laid it out in a grid of 9 squares. And that was done by a surveyor named John Brockett. And so the long and short of it is, these days that's our downtown. It's still the 9 squares. So it's referenced, you're going to the 9th square, these things still exist with us almost 400 years later. And also the interesting fact is that was the first grid, basically, so it led to being a gridded city today in North America.
Wow.
So if you think of New York City being a giant grid, we started.
I mean, every
that kind of
town I go to, it seems like most of them, it's the grid.
Yeah.
And this is where it started, New Haven.
And when you think about it, you go to Boston, it's hard to find your way around Boston. I mean, as it goes out radially, things make more sense, and they changed it. And that happened here in New Haven as well. New Haven's super confusing to get around until you get the understanding, the rhythm, and that's what happens with any city that's old. And here in New Haven, we're lucky in Connecticut that we are about 400 years old, or getting close to that. So yeah, New Haven was established, and it was established as a religious colony, and which meant essentially they set up a fundamental order agreement, and it's essentially said the leaders of the church were the leaders of the colony. So they were kind of dictating the word of God. God is God, yeah. But God speaks to these guys. You listen to them. So,
is this similar to what was laid out with the Massachusetts Bay Colony in Boston, or did it vary here?
It would be similar, but it would be stricter.
Okay.
That was their idea. When they wanted to come here, they wanted more control.
Right.
And it wasn't necessarily nefarious or anything like that, but at the same time, the word of Theophilus Eaton or John Davenport was word. That was it. And interesting enough, their own wives would contest their word, and Theophilus Eaton's wife was seen briefly as a witch, and there was never a full trial or anything, but she was kind of banished. She lived among the community, but she was kind of banished away for being incorrigible. And basically what she did at that point was speak up her mind and say, no, that's ridiculous. You're being this way, you're being that way. Just kind of, when you look at it now, it's almost like, you're looking at someone's relationship.
So in the timeline of things, how did this, her being accused as being a witch, how can we reference the Salem witch trials and what went on in Massachusetts? Is this about the same time period?
I believe those would have come later. This was still very early. I mean, this is like, mid 1600s. And so it was just kind of that idea that goes through New England. It's like, if you don't agree with us on this subject, you're not just disagreeable, you're a witch, right. Or you're a warlock, or you're, some sort of evil is taking you over. And that's kind of a root thing here with things just being really rather pious. Different food you would eat would drive you to evil. So if you drank too much, it would drive you to evil.
So in a biblical sense, it was like Sabbath laws.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly.
Like the Old Testament.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So New England was established, or rather New Haven was established, and New Haven actually was bigger than what we have currently as the colony. We were in Long Island, down in Stamford, even down to New Jersey, were parts of New Haven.
Wow.
And so gradually those parts became their own towns, etc. But essentially, the explorers from New Haven would go out and settle in a little area, and it just made it easier with trade. Because the thing I like to mention to folks is, this was the edge of the world. You might as well have been on the moon, essentially. You know, this was raw frontier, and so you know, ideally everything works out, but you don't know what's going to really happen. And that's something that's I find really intriguing. That's never really expounded on a lot, you know.
Yeah, it's so hard for us with everything with the United States has been fully settled. And the world, to us, as far as we know, has been fully settled, the earth. And it is hard for us to conceive of the idea of on that over there, 5 miles that way, we have, you don't want to go there.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
you have to really prepare to go there. And it allows for the wonder of, man, what could be over there, and then the fear of what could be over there that could come get us.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And you had that here, and but for the most part, it worked out. And New Haven, obviously, is still here. We went through our economic ups and downs. New Haven never really boomed, and that goes throughout its history. 'Cause you had asked me a question the other day about, you know, how colonial threads kind of weave their way here to 2016. And one in particular is the fact that we are a small to mid-size American city. I mean, our population now, I want to say, is about 140,000. So that's relatively small. And we never grew to be the size of a New York. We didn't grow to be a Boston. And a lot of that was our natural resources and limitations with that. And that just continues on. Like, the colony was successful enough to exist, but it didn't exist the way they wanted it to. Religiously, it did, and it grew and changed. Economically, it held on almost by a shoestring at times.
So what have been their economics, the period between this founding, the settling, and the revolution, say? What were the major economic drivers?
You'd have trade with the West Indies was the major trade with New Haven. By that point, too, you had Yale College was founded. It had been founded in Old Saybrook, and then it moved here around 1718, and that was Connecticut's sole college. And really, let's see, about that point, you'd have Harvard, you'd have the Ivy League system forming, because those were really just the only colleges in America.
So their football games and their basketball games were well attended.
Yes.
So
Once they came about.
what are the major differences between Harvard at this point and Yale at this point?
I mean, the major differences, I guess, you look at the curriculum of where they were going with it. Yale, I believe, and again, I'm not really a full Ivy League scholar here, and I might, you know, it's a touchy subject with people, the Yale Harvard thing. But Yale actually looked towards sciences, different ideas on math, and the different threads that were happening here as the Great Awakening would open up in the 17th century.
Yeah, so just let's stop right there, and can you give our listeners a sense of just a little summary of the Great Awakening and how it affected this area?
Yeah, so the Great Awakening is complicated, but, and again, I'm not a large religious scholar by any means, but the gist of it is basically a group of people, it fostered the idea of American democracy, loosely. What you had throughout New England was this reawakening, because the things that had been established 100 or so years before were, for lack of a better term, corrupt. they weren't as it wasn't as pious as it had been. You know, again, you have these people who are just your boss, but you're not calling them the boss, but they're the colony leader, and so sort of power corrupts in a way. And it wasn't any sort of like mob corruption or anything bad like that, but it had gotten away from the point. And so reformers looked to broadening the view of religion and what it meant in people's lives and bringing them back to the fold. And also at that point you had a larger group. You had a population that was more, that was increased, and it was cosmopolitan for the time. You had immigrants already here, not so much in New Haven, but throughout New England. You had Dutch colonies, you had Swedish colonies, or colonists rather. At the time, you still had two colonies in what's Connecticut. You had the Connecticut colony and the New Haven colony still. The New Haven colony became absorbed by the Connecticut colony, and that's also another thread in New Haven. It's part of why we kind of, just as New Haveners, think of ourselves as slightly different. And there's this rivalry between New Haven and Hartford to this day. A lot of it was because they were co-capitals, and that was part of the colony agreement, was they got to share the capital of the colony of Connecticut, which later became the state. And that went until the late 1800s, where we'd actually pack up everything and move it back and forth between cities.
Wow.
Which seems completely impractical.
It does. It does. Let's talk about, you said that the Great Awakening can be credited in a way with expanding American democracy. Can you just kind of get into that?
Yeah,
I
mean, it's credited with this idea of spreading more freedom for people, of being able to control your own lives, control it with your beliefs, and your belief being based in a certain degree of Christian belief. They weren't saying, we want you to be this way or be this way, or you still had to be fairly Christian, but they were also broadening the idea of what you'd study and look at different ideas, different beliefs would become more encompassed. So you were more well-rounded. You weren't just stuck in one viewpoint, and it was just these ideas that kind of stirred it up and became that allowed the population to become more involved. Basically, that there was something to think about. You could have a choice. You didn't just get up, work, pray, go to sleep. There was an option, and so these kind of ideals helped us start stirring things up. And this is the 1700s, kind of early to mid 1700s. So this is about 20 or so years prior to the Revolution. And ideas that would be born out of it later were ideas of temperance, ideas of women's rights, abolitionism. These things all would come from the sharing of ideas.
We wouldn't think of it today, but that it was a religious movement.
Yes.
Like the Great Awakening. There was a man named George Whitefield,
mm-hmm.
and Jonathan Edwards, who I think taught at, was he at Yale? Did he go to Yale, Jonathan Edwards?
I believe so, yes.
But these guys were kind of pillars of this movement, and they would speak, and they would draw thousands and thousands.
Yeah, you would have thousands. They were the stars of the day. And actually New Haven, during the time of the Awakening, it opened its first church, first different church from what they had, and you had the Whitefield Church. And so we eventually started, and even to this day, another thread is on our green, which has also been here since the founding, and it was our market square. It still sits in the heart of the city. And our green today still has 3 different churches on the green. And New Haven became an area that's religiously tolerant, but at the same time, classic New England sort of waspy in a way. That wouldn't change as much until the 1800s, until about when we started building the Farmington Canal, and you had a large influx of Irish immigrants coming in. And with the Irish immigrants came the Catholic Church. and that brought a whole different dynamic to play here in the city.
So let's talk about New Haven during the Revolution.
So New Haven during the Revolution, we actually just discussed this on our show the other day, being it was July 4th. It's kind of like any other city. I mean, aside from Boston, you had, obviously, it was a big pocket of activity. New York was held for the most part by the British. New Haven, it sits between things often during these conflicts. Again, it's economically driven. You know, you had people that were revolutionaries, and they wanted to break away from Britain, but then you had Tories, and you had a lot of those throughout Connecticut and throughout New England, who were people that didn't want to.
All the colonies.
Yeah.
Right? It was a civil war.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's exactly what it was. It wasn't. We saw it as this great, war for independence, but it was a civil war, and often that meant it was a civil war between you and your neighbor, and you agreed or disagreed. So here in New Haven, we for the most part pulled for wanting to be independent, but understood the complications and the conflict that came with that, and also the economic kind of hardship for us in particular. Trade was cut off, so you get a depression of sorts. You get, or what we would call more of a recession at this point. And that led to kind of, for instance, Benedict Arnold's feelings on things.
So now we can talk just briefly about Benedict Arnold and his relation to New Haven.
Well, Benedict Arnold lived here in New Haven on Water Street, which was named because the water came right up to it. These days, if you go down to Water Street and you turn your head towards where the harbor was, there's a giant slab of concrete because the highways came in and closed off, filled in and closed off New Haven kind of from our waterfront. But that's blasting up to the 20th century. Benedict Arnold lived here. He was, in a nutshell, seeking his fortune. He was involved in the West Indies trade. He was kind of a sort of jack of all trades, merchant, fiery guy.
Very, very radical.
Yes, and he had a temper, and he had a temper and always this drive to push himself forward and kind of put himself not necessarily above other people, but he was just one of those guys, He was just so his connection was that he got together a group of men, and they stormed a tavern by the Green, and they demanded the keys to the armory. And we still celebrate this in New Haven every year as Powder House Day, and they wanted the keys to the armory, and they wanted to basically get loaded up with their equipment and then head up to Boston. And this is just after Lexington and Concord, as the militias were sort of all coming together and forming into this very loose continental army. So he ended up succeeding. He went to Hartford, and then they said, okay, these guys are, kind of crazy, but, they're our representatives. And they sent them on to Boston. And, I mean, the long and short of it is he went and led his men through Maine, which at that point was, I think it might have even been different parts of it. Was by no means was a state. It was just wild, crazy frontier, which a lot of it still is. So imagine these guys just went into the thick of it, one up. They circled around. He started he made his name basically becoming a general in these large campaigns, and became known as one of the stars of the revolution, but he was kind of a touchy character. Washington liked him, but he didn't quite trust him. That sort of thing.
Very ego-driven.
He was very ego-driven, and that's what led him kind of to his fall eventually.
He's like, to me, he's like one of America's Greek myths.
Exactly. That's the thing.
He was consumed by his own desire for greatness and acclaim.
Yep.
And he never got it to the measure he deserved. He had bad things happen to him.
Yes.
That was not his fault, but he rather than being the bigger man, he grew bitter.
Yes.
By that, and now his name is synonymous with treachery.
Exactly. Because the thing with him was, he turned his back. He turned his back on America. He turned his back on his own state. He led an attack on New London, Norwich. That's where he was born. He grew up there. So I mean, that's harsh. You not only do you turn to the other side, you go back and you take out your birthplace essentially. And the problem with that was, aside from that just being an issue, the British never trusted him. After the war, he figured, okay, well, these guys are my friends, and their attitude generally throughout the rest of his life was, you're a traitor.
Yeah,
we don't, you helped us, but
right. How can we ever trust you?
Right, exactly. So he just kind of, he's this tragic American figure in that way. It's a perfect
cautionary
description of him.
tale.
Yes. Watch your ego, keep your ego in check, and don't be so consumed with things, I guess.
Yeah, it's so true. It is such a human nature, a flaw of human nature.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he had lived here. The revolution, we were integral in the revolution, but again, there weren't a ton of campaigns. This is also the thing too. It wasn't there may have been spies everywhere. We had one invasion by the British in 1779, and they had landed and they fought some battles on what we call now the East Shore. And actually, we have a historic house. The New Haven Museum has a house, the Party Morris House, and it's one of the oldest structures in New Haven. The previous house was burnt down in the British attack. So the house that's currently there is rebuilt early 1780s. So the British came in, they burnt the house down, took things. The plan was that they were going to move on and take over Yale, actually burn Yale down, hold the city. And they didn't anticipate people not liking that, and they fought back on both ends because they had also landed in the town of West Haven. And instead of a victorious march of, burning Yale down, marching on the green, saying this is now, we've taken this back for Great Britain, they were chased out and fired back on the city and didn't really return. And that was, the big excitement here of wartime. We have some great artifacts here at the museum that were lost by soldiers on both sides. But really the thing with New Haven was post-revolution, being there in the beginning of these ideals of how to form a nation. And that's stuff that's very intriguing here, living with it day to day, and you walk around. I had mentioned the New Haven Green, for instance. The New Haven Green, a few years ago, a tree came down during a hurricane, and underneath it all these skeletons popped up, and people were like, wow, my God, there's dead bodies here. This is, this is the kind of place where, a couple weeks ago we had Parliament Funkadelic play, like the city comes out, it's a city park. And so underneath it, you have these skeletons popping up. And the thing is that most people didn't realize, and may still not realize, is that was a public burial ground.
Wow.
And so during the Revolution, that was still a public burial ground. And by that point, it had gotten out of hand because you didn't have public burial ground. You didn't have cemeteries. This was kind of the birth, and they even loosely involved in this idea of forming modern cemeteries.
Wow.
We had commissioned we have a cemetery around the corner from here, the Grove Street Cemetery, and it's one of the first kind of registered cemeteries in the nation. There's a great one in Boston, actually, Mount Auburn.
Yes, I've heard about that one.
And it's beautiful. I actually highly recommend it if you're in the area. It's really pretty neat. But that, we predate them by, I want to say about 20 years, give or take. So yes, it was a setup. By that point, it was setting up a cemetery, and it's giving this idea of, okay, there's a proper way to do this, and that's part of the beginning. These are things that I think are fascinating about part of the beginning of a new country. They were like, it wasn't just, wake up July 5th, 1776. It's like, okay, we got a state, and we got these rules, and we've got these things going on, and this is how it is. You had to work it all out.
You work it all out.
And so that would have been one of them. One of the things working out was the town leaders realized, this is disgusting. Yeah. We've got bodies poking up.
Everywhere.
There's no
bodies everywhere.
Yeah, there's no regulation. You were starting to figure out that people got sick because it wasn't just God. It wasn't because you walked down the street and you like muttered, something under your breath and then your water went bad or something. Yeah. It's like, no, because this is really filthy. Yeah. And so these were part of some of the new things, and it was that idea of being a new country and kind of, turning your back on, not necessarily turning your back, but proving that the new world was indeed this new great thing on the earth. And here in New Haven, you had that happening. We had a new cemetery, and a lot of that, again, was because that was a bad idea. It was a bad idea to bury people just in the middle of the night. You don't do that, and they realized at that point, okay, this is probably a bad idea. Let's move forward. Let's evolve a little. Let's try doing this. Let's try doing this. Here in New Haven, one of my favorite things that we did was we attempted a national currency. This is where something called a Fugio cent was minted, again on Water Street, right up the street from Benedict Arnold's old house, which also Benedict Arnold's old house ended up becoming Noah Webster's house.
Wow.
And Noah Webster, in a very American democratic thing, started writing the American dictionary in that house here in New Haven.
So for our listeners that don't know too much about Noah Webster, can you give us just a little summary on him?
Yeah, so Noah Webster, what he did essentially was help make the way we speak official, and wrote the first English dictionary, but English in an American sense. So this said the local, because it's like anything today. We have regional differences. People speak differently. There's different accents. That sort of thing is maybe shifting out a little bit more because of television, radio, the internet. But at that point, you had all these different loose dialects. You had different ways of speaking, but it was clearly different from the old world. And he put this in a book. He said, this is official. This is the way Americans speak. The British, they speak that way. These people over here speak this way. We'll say they're this way and mean it, and that's, today we take that for granted, but that's massively influential, and it's influential to people that at that point we're also figuring out, like, is this experiment going to work? How do we actually make this experiment work? You're going back and forth with constitutional conventions, ideas, placing a constitution. I mean, the whole thing, like, how are we going to run our economic system? Should we have slavery? Should we not have slavery? All these ideas were in play. Flashing forward a few years to the Amistad trial, which is complicated, very complicated in its own way, but the gist of it is that a ship that was carrying Africans that had been captured and brought to Cuba to be put into sale as slaves illegally, because the slave trade had been canceled. It was not supposed to exist anymore, but it was not supposed to exist here in America. So Cuba was a different story. They got free, and they mutinied on their ship, wanted to turn the ship around and go back to Africa, didn't realize they were going up the coast, were found off the coast of Connecticut, brought in. They came to New London first, and then they came here to New Haven, and they were put on trial for murder, mutiny and murder of their captors. And so the idea behind that was, how are you trying these Africans? Were they Africans? Were they slaves? Were they free? And a part of the large controversy in that was that they were their defense was pushing that they were free men. and women and children, what have you. But under the U.S. Constitution, they were, supposed to have a fair trial. This was revolutionary at the time because, again, you didn't have the slave trade, but the Emancipation Proclamation obviously wouldn't happen until during the Civil War. So you had this hotbed of abolitionism. New Haven definitely was part of that. The trial happened here.
They were defended by John Quincy Adams?
That would be later on.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. That would be later on when they went to the Supreme Court. Because, again, there were all these appeals that happened. But yes, John Quincy Adams, that's one of my favorite things actually here in the museum is a photo of him from around that trial. So it's wild because it's one of the first photos.
Oh, wow.
And it's, this guy that was, I always like to look at it and be like, you can tell what his eyes had seen, kind of thing.
Right.
And it was just right on that cusp of technologies here in America.
Here you had a man that was a child. He was a child during the Revolution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then he's, we're able to see him in a photograph. He's heavily influential within this American experiment by this point. I like to look at it as once you got to the Civil War, the first phase of America kind of ended, and the Civil War changed and sort of allowed us to be the country we are now. There were certain things that didn't work, that did work, and that culminated in the Civil War. And then clearly things changed after that. And we're still growing and changing from that point. The other thing with the Amistad overall is, and we have it here, it's our kind of crown jewel, is the painting of Joseph Cinque, he was seen as the leader of the group, and the significance of it within American decorative art. It was painted by Nathaniel Jocelyn, who was a staunch abolitionist, and the significance is it was the first time someone that was black that was seen as an equal. They were painted in the light that was as a free man in Western society. Wasn't seen just initially as, I'm depicting a slave here. I'm depicting, and very much in the way he depicts him too. He put him in a toga, he's carrying a staff, he's in front of what looks like one of our outcroppings. We have these two very large basalt rises here above the city, East and West Rock, and so it looks kind of like a combination of those. It's a very grand presentation.
Neoclassical, Greco-Roman.
Yes, exactly. And that in and of itself was a revolutionary depiction in art of helping to establish a more American style, clearly, and also just sort of break down the barriers of what had been previously, how people have been previously depicted.
So moving to the Civil War, and in the Civil War, what role did New Haven play?
So during the Civil War, New Haven, again, was kind of caught in this conflict between economics and loyalty. New Haven was hit somewhat hard by the Civil War because we had a very large carriage trade here. We were essentially, we've been called the Detroit of carriages. So tons of carriages were produced here and sent out, and large consumers and buyers of carriages, for the most part, were in the South. So that was one of the things, too, that when you start fighting a war, and this also impacted other northern cities as well. You had the cotton trade was disrupted, so you didn't have textiles. By that point, New England was filled with tons of textile mills. So you weren't getting these materials in, trade was blocked off, you had disruptions with Europe. So there were times where it was just, people were feeling it in the pocket. Almost immediately too. We discussed this the other day, how just immediately resources went up in price. So it was difficult to even print newspapers, paper, ink, etc. And that was just from the beginning. Overall, New Haven supported the Civil War, but yeah, it was kind of stuck in this the middle here economically. We had we were different in the effect that we weren't like New York, which actually wanted to secede at one point.
Right.
Things that were starting to be established here at that point were things like modern hospitals that came out of the Civil War. You had the differences at that point. The city itself was a bit more cosmopolitan, and it was actually becoming increasingly so. So an interesting point was immigration was booming throughout the Civil War. You had thousands of people still coming to America, but coming to New Haven.
And when we think
especially.
about immigration at this point, we're thinking of
For the most part, you're thinking Irish. At that point, it was mostly Irish and Germans that were pouring in. So that was changing the whole fabric of the city, in essence. And they had arrived. Irish had come in large waves about 20 or so years earlier when we started building the Farmington Canal. And Farmington Canal was our stab at an Erie Canal.
right.
Canals were all the rage at that point.
They
you
were
know?
in the 19th century.
Yeah, they were the thing. And but again, that falls into this American nationalism. They were the first interstates. This was an idea of like, okay, you can get in and you can connect, and that'll make us all connected. And it's brilliant. It's a brilliant idea that roads and traffic and communication does keep people connected.
Was it privately funded?
The Farmington Canal was privately, it was a mix. And I want to say it had at least 3 different banks were founded and like went out of business over the course of it.
Yeah.
It was that kind of thing. And again, this is prior to the Civil War, post the Fugio cent here in America, which didn't take off, by the way. That was minted. They tried it. It didn't work. And you didn't really have a national currency until the Civil War. So yeah, you just, like, banks could print their own money, you know? So you'd be like, okay, well, we ran out of money from those investors. Let's make a new bank. And we got this guy backing it, so it's okay. And so for the lack of a better description, the Farmington Canal was a colossal mistake. I mean, it wasn't. It was incredible engineering feat. It connected New Haven Harbor with Northampton, Massachusetts.
Okay.
So you could go up there. To this day, you could still sort of follow the parts of the canal, and now it's becoming rail to trails and all that. And what it ended up doing was it was complete. And it only really ran for a couple of years because by the time it took so long to build, it took 20 or so years to build, the railroads came in, and so your next wave of technology, your next transportation revolution sort of thing happened, and it made it easy for the trains because they just placed the trains on the beds of the canal. And they did that often all around in different, all around the country at that point. But the train really just changed it all, and it was cheap and easier, and the canal just didn't work, but it did help establish this New Haven on the map that way, and it also grew up our waterfront as well. And as our waterfront, I had mentioned Water Street before. Another interesting New Haven thing here is that New Haven was the first, where the first steamboat voyage on the open water was between New York City and New Haven. And that was something that changed. That was another giant. People don't think of steamboats.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, okay, steamboat's a nice thing to do on a Sunday afternoon, sort of.
Who
thing.
ran that steamboat? Do you recall?
I believe it was Fulton was involved, and he was the one that had built was doing the trials on the Hudson. So the first trial on the open water was between the Hudson River and New Haven, and so we would develop this pretty good steamboat business, and eventually the trains poured in, it connected the steamboats. You go in and out, and you had a good system there. And our train system here would grow into the largest, eventually the largest train system east of the Mississippi. So you had the New York, New Haven, and Hartford line was based here in New Haven, and it became tremendous, where you could get anywhere in the country from New Haven.
Wow, that must really have changed New Haven.
Yeah, I mean, by that point you had and that would come about late 19th century. The way New Haven changed and grew, and it was like any other city throughout the country, or at least the eastern seaboard. You had just tons of immigrants coming in. You had tons of innovation. And you had these cities just growing quickly and industrializing quickly. The Civil War was that sort of thing, that catalyst, that
turning
really,
point in history.
Yeah, that pushed the North into just being these industrial mega powers in a way.
Jason, we're running out of time, but I want to talk about New Haven in the 20th century and present day. You mentioned a couple things when we were on the phone about some pretty incredible historical events that happened here.
Yes. So New Haven, I guess mentioning this transportation idea and all of that, by the 20th century, World War II happened. The Depression happened. World War II happened. New Haven was an integral city during World War II. We had a lot of gun manufacturers here. You had Winchester Arms located here. You had Marlin located here, along with the rest of Connecticut. Connecticut's known as it's an arms state. You know, we eventually Groton would make the nuclear subs.
Wow,
that sort of thing. We're a defense state.
Yeah,
and so New Haven was producing that. And what you had post-World War II, as we see all around the country, is the highway system would come in. Cities changed, and the suburbs grew, and the whole thing that we're all familiar with. The thing with New Haven was, it was, aside from Newark, New Jersey, it received the most federal money for urban renewal efforts than any other place in the country. So, and you can see this because this is something that's...
what year is this?
This would be the 1950s,
Okay.
about 1949 onward. And so, again, these things are a complicated sort of thing, but basically what you had was the story of how the suburbs grew. The GI Bill allowed people to go to school. You could go and buy your own house. They wanted cheap housing, and everyone had this American dream sort of ideal because we had this incredible economy. We'd wiped everybody else out, so the American economy was just robust, and the idea to get out of the cities were kind of falling into being slums and disrepair, and to modernize the cities. When New Haven was led by, he was elected at the age of 37, Richard C. Lee, and he was this very dynamic politician that had grown up here, and his idea was just to get a hold of this federal money and create a whole new city, like a model city for the 21st century. And what that did was essentially tear down half to 2/3 of the city itself. And so you had things that today, for instance, we're now rebuilding. We're tearing down a highway. We're tearing down the Route 34 connector. But to put that in the 50s, an entire neighborhood that was mostly immigrant-based, it was one of the oldest neighborhoods in the city, was just taken out. So
cities are about the future.
Yes.
We go over, this comes up so many episodes we've done on this show.
And you see this all over, and that's something, because here in New Haven, they'll be like, urban renewal ruined this, or changed this, and did this, but it was everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I like to point out that
right.
it's, you go to New Hampshire, and you go to the small town, you see a relatively modern bank, something like that, a structure that would be seen as brutalist or something like that. That was urban renewal trickling down to everywhere.
Jason, this has been great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you
so much. I'd love to do again. I feel like we touched on so many subjects briefly. I want to come back and we can get
absolutely.
into some particulars.
You're always welcome here in New Haven. We've got a lot of obviously a lot of history. The New Haven Museum here, we're over 150 years old. We were founded during the Civil War, and we were known as the New Haven Colony Historical Society. So we've got a lot of New Haven history here. We're your spot for that, and we love always seeing new people to tell new stories to.
And Jason, plug your radio show and your podcast.
So our podcast is This Day in New Haven History, and that's through the New Haven Independent radio station WNHH 103.5 FM, and that streams on SoundCloud and on iTunes. And for fun as well, I have a radio show on WPKN 89.5 FM here in Connecticut, and it's called The Relay. And broadcasts every second Tuesday of the month from 11 to 2 and worldwide through apps, streaming, iTunes, all that good stuff. And that's an all vinyl music show, and please tune in. We do history a little differently on that show, but we have a great time.
Well, I highly recommend both of those shows, and I highly recommend everybody come down here to the New Haven History Museum. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Bob.
Well, thank you for joining us on The Road to Now. Please be sure and find us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at road_to_now, or visit our website, theroadtonow.com. And thank you so much for all the great comments and the ratings on iTunes. That really helps to get the word out about the show. We really appreciate it. Until next time, for Dr. Ben Sawyer, this is Bob Crawford. Take care.